Assalamu alaikum. We are formally going to start our session on the economy of debt, alternatives to austerity and neoliberalism in Pakistan. And we are very thankful to Dr. Aasim, Sajjad, Akhtar, Nawfal Saleemi and Ammar Rashid to be with us. It's basically a draft position paper on the IMF deal and a progressive approach to the Pakistani economy. Before we start, I'll give a brief introduction to our prestigious panelists. Dr. Aasim Sajjad Akhtar is an academic and an author associated with the Awami Workers' Party. He is an assistant professor at Aasim University and has also taught at the Lahore University of Management Sciences. He has acquired his education from prestigious institutes like Northwestern University, Yale University and SOAS University of London. Mr. Ammar Rashid is a Pakistani researcher, academic and political worker for the Awami Workers' Party. He has taught at Aasim University and PIDE and worked in the public and social sector on education, health and urban reforms. He did his bachelor's from LUMS and his master's in development studies is from the University of Sussex. And Nawfal Saleemi is a young researcher and works as a community program secretary of the Awami Workers' Party. He completed his bachelor's from Lahore in 2016 and worked in Middle East after graduating, but returned back and has been active in Islamabad's development scene ever since. So we'll formally start the session with Dr. Aasim Sajjad. Please, sir.
Okay, this one. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Fahad, and to all of you for being here, and for, from what I understand, to the Vice Chancellor for suggesting to Ammar, or actually encouraging him very vociferously to organize this event. I hope he will be here because he'll have lots to say about what we've written, one way or the other. So just very briefly, the idea for this paper, obviously, I mean, what is in this paper is actually not new, neither is it very a great revelation. In some ways, it's actually quite straightforward, and it was triggered by the fact that some months ago, the government, which of course for many months had insisted that it would never do anything like this, but about a year in decided that it would do exactly what all other governments prior to it had done, which is go and ask the IMF to get it out of jail. And this was, by our estimation, I think, the 13th such program over the course of over the course of about 3 decades. So in some sense, what we wanted to do was to say, look, why does this keep happening? What's the story here? What is it about both the state of Pakistan's economy and then the set of what are called structural reforms that tend to be, sort of regurgitated time and again? What about this story has caused it to be sort of a repetitive cycle that never seems to, you never seem to move away? And every 5 years, essentially, you have it repeating itself. B, quite frankly, the idea was to put some of the politics back into the discussion of the economy, which, in our understanding, at least in recent years, let's say the last, since I was an undergraduate in the late 1990s, or in the middle of the 1990s, at the very least, if not before that, mainstream economics had become essentially an effort to actually, in some ways, abstract from the real world and actually, especially political realities. So, very briefly, before we come to the program and more details about the specificities of what we put in our paper is something that Ammar and then Nawfal will give you details of. I'll just give you a brief overview. Basically, there is a recurrent problem, and it's 7.5 decades in the making. And without thinking about this problem, a recurrent problem, a structural problem, one of those real structural issues which, of course, the IMF and, generally speaking, our economic managers, with some exception, some notable exceptions in the room, generally speaking, these are sort of, this is the big elephant in the room that we never want to talk about. And it seemed to us like we weren't really saying anything particularly, brilliant or innovative. We were just stating what is the ultimate structural fact of our sort of decision making with regards to resources and the larger question of how we manage the economy. And that is that our state, historically, since its very inception, has essentially been a state that tends to generate strategic rents, largely on the basis of geography and then superpower conflicts. This is the way it was during the Cold War. This remains how it is now, especially since 2001, as we've seen over the last few days. Once again, the state is essentially in a position where it generally, one way or the other, even despite what rhetoric might be being put out in the mainstream, tends to take sides and tends to generate rents from taking sides. Most notably by essentially being a client of the United States during the Cold War and generating all manner of strategic rents from doing so. More specifically, this also means that we sort of suffer from a Dutch disease sort of problem, right? Which is that we are actually quite a well-endowed country. And in recent years, you've seen that, particularly with the peripheries, with Sindh and Balochistan, and after the 18th Amendment recently, there was stuff in the news about how, gas shortages in urban centers was leading to this sort of demand, I don't know where it was coming from, but this demand for the provinces to forego their rights over their own sort of particularly natural gas resources. But you've also seen at the same time scandals with Rekudik and Sendak, the fact that we openly acknowledge in the Senate that we build Gwadar and we give 91% of the revenues away to a foreign country. These are simply symptoms of a larger, long-standing structural reality. Of course, very simply, part of the issue is that you have an arm of the state making decisions about the economy which it is simply not equipped or entitled to do, which is the armed forces. So there is a long-standing structural problem. If you look at our standard budgetary allocations year after year, you take out debt servicing and defense, and you're left with 30-odd%. So if you can't talk about that, then it's no surprise that you're constantly suffering from some fundamental imbalances in the economy, quite aside from other factors. And the other factors then take us to the question of the fund and Pakistan, and not just the fund, the IFIs in general, what was once called structural adjustment, what in the broader literature is called neoliberalism. Again, a long history. It's a Cold War history. It's a political history. This notion that somehow these are simply technical matters which have no either ramifications politically or are not the cause of explicit political sort of questions, I think is part of what this paper was designed to sort of raise or question, or to sort of at least put out there. And so the story with the fund. So on the one hand, we have this sort of largely this white elephant that we cannot talk about, and then the rest of it is subject to a set of fairly standard prescriptions, which we have repeated again and again in these 13 programs. And you can see all of them here, with some exception. In some phases, we've done more of one or less of the other, but more generally, and this was the story of course, most poor middle-income countries throughout Asia and Africa and Latin America through the late 70s, through the 80s, after like the heyday of internationalism and the G77 had passed, and Thatcherism and Reaganism became the order of the day. This was sort of what all poor and middle-income countries were subjected to, sort of a fiscal disciplining and a notion that somehow there's something that is simply incorrigible about maintaining deficits even though, as we know, the world's largest deficit spending country is the United States itself. So there's quite aside from the double standards associated with this the sort of the philosophical underpinnings of adjustment and IMF programs. It was also, like I said initially, for us the purpose was to say, look, we've done it again and again. There's a big chunk of the whole political economic story that we don't talk about. So it's no wonder that this keeps recurring. It's no wonder that this story seems to play out every 5 years. Briefly, for us, what we wanted to emphasize in the paper then was what is not generally, which is talked about, but perhaps, again, without a clear assertion of the kinds of political or the will that is required if you really want to address this, right? Basically, we're not really productive enough. We have huge sectors of the economy dedicated to non-productive ends. When that is the case, then you are not going, especially with a rapidly increasing population and the pressures associated with that, you are never going to be able to keep up with, in some ways, your own demands of your own society to expand, economic output. Insofar as there is on the surface, when you see figures, for instance, as again in this country happens often, a lot of these debates, I think we should now be able to move beyond. But for instance, this notion that, oh look, every military regime has good growth rates, and so on and so forth. The last one that we all lived through was, of course, Musharraf, and now it's quite apparent that a lot of that was a lot of bubbles based on cheap credit to consumers, based on sort of high return sectors like real estate and the stock market, and those don't last. And in the last 10 years in the rest of the world, I think that's become sufficiently clear. The last thing I would like to actually point out is exactly that. Since 2008, this notion that just opening up everything and deregulating everything and leaving everything to the whims of, well, not the whims, but let's say to the more rational, so to speak, logic of market forces, which is of course what neoliberalism and the whole sort of philosophical underpinnings of much of this this intervention was about, I think have come into serious question. And you see that there's a big disjunct now in Western countries between the politics of what's going on in those countries, where political leaders are actually saying, wait, hold on, this whole idea about globalizing and everything opening up wasn't so great after all. And then the fact that in effect the global economy still functions on the basis of essentially global financial flows, which are essentially either unregulated or deliberately allowed to carry on in the ways that they do, without substantial or meaningful regulation in favor of labor more generally, but in favor of especially the poor in particular. So I think that what we want to say is this is not some kind of radical manifesto. This is simply an analysis of the situation as it is played out in Pakistan more specifically, but you could extrapolate to the rest of the world over the last 30 years. For Pakistan and specifically, this story then can be traced back 4 decades even further back to the inception of the state and its logic and national security and so on and so forth. And as you know, this continues to play out every day in every sphere of life, but in economic matters it tends to be unnamed in ways that we think are need to be redressed. And so it's not a radical manifesto. It offers us a way of thinking about the kinds of, albeit difficult, in Pakistan's context perhaps it could be considered radical in many ways, but the analytical logic of what we're putting out there, and then the very sort of in some ways straightforward short-term and somewhat longer-term measures that we then propose do not constitute some kind of all land to the tiller or all confiscating all private properties in case there's anybody here who's like thinks there's a Red Scare going on or anything. That's nothing like it. So I'll leave it at that. This is just a brief overview, and then Ammar and Nawfal will give you more specifics about the paper itself. Thank you.
That's fine. Thank you, Aasim. I'm very grateful to Nadeem al-Haq and PIDE for inviting us here to discuss some ideas that, like Aasim said, in Pakistan's case at least, are generally not the subject of mainstream economic debate. And that's essentially what we try to do with this paper. To make it very clear, this wasn't intended as an exclusively academic paper, nor was it intended as an exclusively political document. This is a synthesis to try and look at the evidence that exists in academia by researchers in Pakistan, and then present it in a synthesized way to actually generate public debate rather than just within academic halls, so we can actually broaden the scope of economic debate in the country. So Aasim has given us a brief context of why we wrote this and the broader state and global context in which this crisis is situated. I'm going to talk briefly about the various sort of sectoral issues within the Pakistani economy that we have tried to focus on, which we think are the principal causes of our crises. So we speak a lot about the twin crises, the twin deficits problem, both in terms of the balance of payments issue and the fiscal deficit. So we try to operate around those two issues being one of the principal reasons we keep returning to the IMF in terms of macroeconomic variables. So we've tried to break that down and to see where those issues are really stemming from. So Aasim spoke a little bit about rentier state and how we sort of prioritized renting out our strategic location to external clients. And what this has done is, and also relied on a remittance-based growth strategy from the 80s onwards. This continues to be one of our principal sources of foreign exchange earnings. So the rentier state model has essentially it's enabled a national security orientation of the state. It's perpetuated it, and this has sort of also reproduced the clientelistic logic of the state. So you have also this rent-seeking logic reproduced throughout the state's bureaucratic apparatus and sort of the relationships that it has formed with various political patrons, in which resources are distributed not on the basis of actually distributing public services to the people on the basis of their rights, but on the basis of their relationships, their informal relationships with the state. And then critically what it has done is that there has not been a real emphasis on increasing or boosting domestic production in the country, and this is a problem we see in rentier states across the world, whether it's more similarly placed ones like Egypt, which again have simply have morphed into the role of a security provider, and similarly have chronic issues with having to return to the IMF because they cannot produce sufficient output domestically to be able to finance their imports. And also it has essentially militarized our economy, and this is true for large sectors from transport, freight and logistics, how the NLC has taken over the functions performed by the railways, whether it's infrastructure projects, which are now much of the country, including for CPEC, are handled by the FWO, in housing, whether things like DHA, agriculture through fertilizer companies like 4G Fertilizer, in banking, insurance, construction, in telecommunications and so on. And so we have non-security related business investments of the military now. According to some estimates, it's difficult to actually get exact estimates because of a lack of transparency, but estimated as even close to $100 billion in economy the size of Pakistan's, so this is also in some senses crowding out a lot of private investment in a lot of areas, and also preventing public services from functioning as they should. Then we looked a little bit at the crisis in domestic production, because if we're talking about the current account, the balance of payments crisis, a large part of the reason for that is that our growth, essentially, our export growth has stagnated in the past decades. So from 2005 to 2016, Pakistani exports grew just about 36%, In the same period, Bangladesh's exports grew about 313%, India's by 300%. You see similar numbers for the South Asian region. With Pakistan, it just stagnated, while our imports, like Aasim pointed out, during the Musharraf era particularly, we followed like a very consumption-based, like consumption-driven imports increased drastically. So now we are in a situation where we import about twice as much as we export. And so a large part of the reason for this, so again, it's a crisis of domestic production, specifically a crisis in domestic manufacturing. About 60% of Pakistani GDP now consists of the services sector. And some people have spoken of, like, since the 80s onwards, a lot of, even the developed world has gone through what some have called deindustrialization, with the shift of productive enterprise towards Asian economies like China, Taiwan, South Korea, and so on. So in Pakistan, this industrialization has also happened, but we never industrialized in the first place. So it's, some people call it premature deindustrialization. And so part of this has to do with the same processes of financialization, deregulation that have transformed consumption and production across the world. And we've seen, like, globally a shift from forest manufacturing in the 20th century and settled agriculture towards more informal, precarious, low-wage work in the services sector. And then we've also seen, especially from the 2000s onwards, the growth in non-labor intensive sectors like real estate and retail, which now comprises a significant section of Pakistani GDP. And then obviously this is compounded by the fact that now majority of Pakistan's workforce is also self-employed, mostly in the informal sector. And given that the informal manufacturing sector is unable to absorb the unskilled and semi-skilled workers flowing into especially urban areas, often informal wage work and self-employment represents the only survival strategy. So the reason we pointed this out was that for some years now, the IMF in particular has also pushed this idea that we are now moving towards a post-industrial age, that the manufacturing driven trajectories followed by much of the developed world no longer need to be followed, and there's some isolated examples they point to, such as like Singapore, some other smaller East Asian states that have developed on the back of services alone, and financial industries and so on, and that, like, especially with now the growth of the new startup economy, services-based startup economy, this has led to many believing that developing countries can also just focus on services and they don't have to worry about manufacturing anymore. But there's been a lot of research in recent years about how manufacturing continues to be very, very critical for economic growth. There are still no examples of developing countries that have achieved economic development without a healthy domestic industrial base, with the exception of oil-rich states and like small city states like Singapore and Hong Kong. That manufacturing has a much greater multiplier effect on employment, productivity growth and innovation than other sectors. And also this idea that there's this new idea also that all of manufacturing is just going to be replaced by automation and anyway, and artificial intelligence, etc. There's also new research that shows that a lot of these concerns are also overblown, and specifically in developing country contexts, the jobs that are actually at risk from being lost to automation are just about 2 to 5% of the current jobs available. So this points to the need that for Pakistan as well, we need to reorient our policy paradigm to figure out how we can actually create a labor intensive and perhaps not necessarily, we don't have to repeat the Industrial Revolution, and this perhaps should be consciously more ecologically sustainable. There's talk in Africa now of new green industrialization strategies that certain countries are trying to implement, but we do need to look at what other countries have also done in terms of funneling agricultural surpluses to broader value chains that can help with import substitution and towards labor intensive manufacturing, and we need to figure out how to regulate finance to actually funnel those surpluses towards productive enterprise, and also at the same time prepare the workforce for the fourth industrial revolution and move capital from non-tradable goods and services to tradable commodities that actually can be used in international markets as well. Then there's the linked crisis of public finance. Pakistan again has one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios in the world. We speak about this a lot. We are very obviously indebted to the work of people like Dr. Ikram al-Haq, who has been talking about this for decades. Our enormous reliance on indirect taxes, about 75% of the total revenue that the state collects. We have one of the highest proportions of tax loss as a percentage of GDP in the world. And so one thing that I feel we pointed out what we really need to focus on, and I think many others in this room have also spoken about, is the effect of statutory regulatory ordinances, or SROs, which are essentially instruments for tax concessions, waivers and exemptions to powerful industrial and financial interest groups for various excuses that supposedly they help with exports, supposedly these are industries that help with growth, but essentially these are instruments that are issued behind closed doors by unaccountable bureaucrats without any sort of democratic debate about what kind of industries we're giving these tax holidays to or these tax concessions to. There's been research done by people like Dr. Ikram and others that estimate the annual tax loss from such exemptions, evasions and loopholes at about $10.8 billion per annum. So we do need to have a debate about or a massive audit of these SROs, and specifically democratize this process as it happens in many other countries around the world. If you are giving tax exemptions and waivers to certain industries or interest groups, this needs to be democratically debated, and the power to issue those exemptions needs to rest with Parliament rather than a grade 20 bureaucrat who can do that at a closed door meeting in FPR. Then obviously we also have to look at expenditures, and again, like the biggest elephant in the room being how our military spending, in terms of how we're the 20th largest military spender in the world despite only having the 40th largest economy, and that needs to be rationalized. And also in terms of public sector reform of Pakistan's state institutions in general. And again, the general mantra about this is just privatize them all. But again, I think we need to have a more evidence-based approach towards this, which we do talk about a little bit in our paper. They absolutely do need to be reorganized and restructured. In some cases, maybe privatization could help, but we have seen instances such as PTCL, for instance, which was privatized in 2006, and since then has seen its market value plummet by 75% and resulted in more than $3 billion loss to the government. And we have various other examples like this in which the privatization process simply led to a new regime of crony capitalism, in which certain economic interests continue to seek rents through the sale of those public assets. So just the point that we like to make is, with respect to the public enterprises, privatization isn't just a one-size-fits-all solution, and especially in countries like Pakistan that are not very well equipped in adequately regulating the private sector to ensure that it actually is effective and efficient as it needs to be. So this is something that we have to think about. Nawfal will talk a bit more detail about the kind of proposals that we have. Then there is the question of labor productivity, which is very obviously tied to the question of production in general. Pakistan has one of the lowest labor productivity rates in the world. Since the 1980s, labor productivity up to the 1980s, labor productivity growth was about 4.2%. Since then, this has plummeted to about 1.8%. And since 2007, from the 1990s onwards, it was 1.3%, 1.8 to 1.3%. From 2007 onwards, it is now 1%. And by comparison, in India, labor productivity continues to go right now at about 5% per annum. In China, it's going at 8.8% per annum. And so this obviously is a massive problem in terms of Pakistani firms being able to compete, specifically in international markets. And it's also inhibited the uptake of technology. So labor productivity is essentially a question of your workers and how well you're sort of training, equipping, and skilling your workers, what normally economists refer to as human capital. So the research tells us that our low productivity levels are a symptom of the state's inability or unwillingness to invest in the knowledge, skills, and well-being of its population, or at least organize the economy in a way so that happens. So we have for long spent an insufficient fraction of our GDP on education. We have continued to have one of the lowest literacy rates in the world, about 58%. We continue to have 22 million children out of school. 50% of our primary school students drop out of school before secondary school. And higher education is in a similarly terrible state. We spend about 0.3% of our GDP on higher education, and this is reflected in global rankings. We have about 3 universities in the world's top 800, none in the top 200. But it's not just about what we're spending, obviously. It's about how we design our curricula, which fail to impart any of the critical components that a 21st century education requires. Instead, we have, for decades we have had, our educational curricula has been egged on by paranoid and authoritarian state policies that have sort of stamped out critical thinking, fostered extremism on our campuses, and prevented the development of a healthy campus culture in which students can debate and freely ask questions without being labeled as blasphemers or traitors. And I think this has very concrete economic impacts on the quality of the human capital that you're producing. Then obviously there's a question of health. The chronic deficits in nutrition result in about 66% of Pakistani children suffering from stunting or anemia, which has enormous effects on their mental development. And then, so there have been studies which we've cited in this paper about how the economic consequences of undernutrition to Pakistan are estimated about $7.6 billion a year in terms of lost productivity. So you need to create a modern, skilled and productive labor force. You need to overhaul our public education systems, both in terms of financing and curricula, and also ensuring that firms also invest in the professional capacities of their workers and help finance educational and vocational skills programs for the working population. And then also we've cited research about the link between working conditions and productivity. Workers, there's been research around the world and in Pakistan, but in terms of how workers with living wages, humane working conditions and access to basic health and education services are much more productive than those without them. In Pakistan, since the 1980s onwards, working conditions have continued to deteriorate. Real wages in Pakistan, we have some data over there. This is compiled by Kamal Munir and Natalia Naqvi. Since the 1990s, real wages have essentially stagnated. They have barely grown, and informal sector employment has just mushroomed. So there is, and a large part of the reason for this is there is not really any sort of conception of sort of ensuring worker well-being, and the terms of work have deteriorated spectacularly. So essentially, to address the crisis of productivity, there needs to be a concerted effort to reverse our historical neglect of the knowledge, skill and well-being of our working population. Then there's a question of women's potential. We have some of the, obviously the lowest female literacy rates in the world and one of the lowest female labor force participation rates, about 24%. This is obviously compared to much of our region. These are enormously exponentially low. In China it's 60%, in Vietnam it's 73%, even in Bangladesh it's 40%. And we also have one of the largest gender wage gaps in the world. A large part of this has to do with patriarchal gender norms in which women are still kept under the confines of parda and not allowed to work outside the home. These are normally not discussed in economic conversations, but this is a massive loss to the economy. And the vast majority of women that do work are simply low-wage laborers in either agriculture or domestic employment. So the women's unpaid domestic labor has been estimated by several studies at being valued at tens of billions of dollars. And so a large part of the reason for this also has to do with discrimination in terms of asset ownership and ownership of property, which is women own something like less than 2% of assets in Pakistan, which is an obscene number. So it's obviously very difficult for them to enter the workforce, especially given the other educational and social constraints that they face. And there's a question of land that we tried to look at. I think this is something that requires a lot of debate. It's something that people like Nadeem al-Haq have also been talking about. I think even if we approach the question from different ends of the spectrum, I still feel that this is a question that we all need to think about very, very deeply. I think we've spoken about how this has to do with Pakistan. Unlike many East Asian states, there's a really good sort of book by Joseph Studville on it's called How Asia Works, and he's looked at development strategies in East Asia and how they sort of the Asian tiger, so to speak, and what strategies they followed. And one of the main components of all of their reform strategies was land reform that took place in the 70s, 80s onwards, which sort of freed up a lot of the workforce from land and sort of directed those surpluses into more productive sort of areas. So in Pakistan that hasn't really happened in any meaningful way. There's widespread rural landlessness which has spurred urbanization in search of employment. So this has also spurred in the past couple of decades in conjunction with international financial flows, the rapid rise of the real estate sector, which is one of the fastest growing in the world now, and which it grew at about 112% between 2012 and 2017. But at the same time, this has mushroomed, and it has become a very profitable source of investment and savings for a large part of the population. But at the same time, now we've gotten to a point where we have real estate assets in Pakistan worth hundreds of billions of dollars, much of which are simply unimproved land. Whereas the total amount of tax that the sector collects annually is about 23 billion rupees. Just for a comparison, Malik Riaz paid 450 billion rupees or more just to legalize Bahria Town, Karachi, which is just one of his many investments, and he's just one of many property tycoons. So consider that number for just that one investment, and the total tax collected on real estate about at 23 billion rupees. So there's clearly a lot. It's not being transparently taxed, and it's being used as a commodity rather than as a usable asset, which has this is combined with the control over land by landowning bureaucracies like CDA, LDA, and other civil military bureaucrats who continue to place opaque regulations on the use of land and which sort of incentivize sprawl and sort of disallow mixed use, dense construction and high rises from taking place, which is limiting the supply of land. And at the same time, it's also made real estate a sort of capital trap in Pakistan. There's data that we've collected from the State Bank of Pakistan in which we looked at sort of financial savings, which is essentially what people are putting into the financial sector. And they were sort of rising in Pakistan from throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s onwards. And then in 2000 onwards, we just see them falling drastically, sort of drastically reducing the actual circulation of liquid cash in the economy. And the major reason for that is this is concurrent with the beginning of the real estate boom under Musharraf, fueled by the rise of remittances and international financial flows. So again, this is not to say, obviously, savings, it makes sense for a lot of people to save their money in plots because they offer much more lucrative returns than financial savings do. But this is a problem when our financial sector is weakened as a result of this, and there's less money also to lend. So we need to think very critically about how we are organizing and distributing land in this country, and need to update our zoning and regulatory policies accordingly through an urban land reform agenda. Finally, there's a question of agriculture productivity. Again, this is tied to also the challenges within this are tied to the historical lack of land reform. A very small percentage of landowners own about 64% of farmland. Small farmers have limited access to water inputs and extension, which has led to the rise of informal agricultural wage labor. Then there's also the question in recent years of the monopolization of seed inputs and the fact that small farmers are not allowed to really produce seeds that are according to their environment, and they're forced to produce seeds at much higher prices from GMOs, which is really affecting agricultural productivity. So we have one of the lowest yield breakers in the entire world, and then this is tied to the question of lack of extension and support services in agriculture. Then there's also the question of banking and finance, again from the 80s onwards. Since the deregulation of the banking sector, bank lending to the private sector has actually shrunk massively in Pakistan from 25 to 16%. And the reason for this is banks in Pakistan earn mainly through government securities, through lending to the government, which they have to because the government is chronically running these deficits, and they've been lending to consumers. So Pakistani banking sector has one of the highest spreads in terms of the difference between saving and lending rates in the world, about 6% compared to 2% in Korea, 3% in Malaysia. Taxes have gradually been reduced for banks under the Musharraf era. They were reduced from 56% to 30%, and the result is that we have extremely low savings rates and extremely low financial inclusion. About 21% of the Pakistani population has a bank account compared to 74% in Sri Lanka, over 80% now in India. And banks have been concentrated. About 5 banks account for the vast bulk of deposits. So the regulation of the banking sector has not really had the deregulation of the banking sector has not had the impact that it has. And similarly for energy, what we've had since 1994 is the deregulation of the energy sector, which were essentially handed over to IPPs, which was essentially another form of crony capitalism in which they were guaranteed rates of return about 15 to 20% per annum and given fixed capacity payments regardless of what they were producing. So now we have in a position where the government has to continue paying IPPs regardless of what they're producing. They've exempted them from taxes and duties without any efficiency incentives, and this has resulted in much more costlier energy production than what we were producing earlier, about $21 million more per plant than what was possible in the public sector. And this has also led to the change in our fuel mix from the bulk of it was produced by hydropower in the 90s, and now the bulk of it is produced by more expensive thermal power. And this has also contributed to a slowdown in industrial output. So, so these are some of the areas that we've identified in terms of which are causing many of the structural problems in the economy. Again, this is not an exhaustive account, but it is an attempt to synthesize evidence that exists. So we've discussed some policy proposals at the end. Nawfal will come and talk about. Again, these are not like complete; they're open for debate, but they are, in a sense, an attempt to actually say what areas we actually should be pushing for action on. So I'd like to ask Nawfal to come and conclude.
Thank you, Aasim. Thank you, Ammar. I'll hopefully try and take not too long, but might not succeed at that. So to get started, some of the measures and the point at which we wrote this paper was just before the budget was about to be introduced and this deal was about to be signed. And there were some things that we said needed to be done immediately, otherwise you'd fall into a lot of inflation, falling growth, and subsequently unemployment, inequality, poverty, and debt and death. So but unfortunately none of them were taken care of, and as per the IMF mandate and prescription, a free floating interest rate was unleashed, which led to a rapid devaluation of the rupee. And subsequently, since, as per the diagnosis that has been laid out by Ammar and Aasim, since we don't produce a lot and mainly import as much, twice as much as we export, that led to a lot of increase in prices, so inflation, and almost like a stagflation-like scenario in which growth is falling and inflation is rising. Similarly, we said that in order to combat the impact of that fallout in terms of unemployment, underemployment, degrowth and inflation, what needed to be done was new taxes on wealth, income, end to SROs, defense expenditure. What happened, what we heard one day that, oh, defense expenditure is not going to be increased this year. A couple of days later we heard that, oh, you know what, there's going to be a supplementary grant for the defense sector. So as while everyone else is supposed to cut their expenditure and squeeze their wallets further, defense expenditure has to go up because, well, nazuk surat hal. And one of the other key points that we raised was the fact that debt obligations, which are far too much in the next 2 years and even more so after that, need to be talked about and need to be negotiated with the creditors. Not only restructuring, but debt relief has to be asked for, and these are not taboo topics. This has been done historically, and given strategic changes in the region, that can be done again. So given the importance of Pakistan regionally, this is not something that cannot be done. And plus, I mean, the moment you tell creditors, oh, we can't pay, they will panic, and for an economy like Pakistan, it's not going to be treated the same way, for instance, like Greece would be. So just some of the gotcha moments here. So what are some of the medium to long term measures that can be undertaken? I'll just highlight the main ones for you. Primarily, there's a need to move from a rentier state, which is based on rent seeking, to a state that is concerned with development, social and economic, of the most marginalized people first and foremost. And that means that all economic, political and foreign policy decisions have to be based on their contribution to a sustainable and equitable economic impacts for everyone else. There has to be civil-led accountability of elites, military and otherwise, in terms of how they have captured public land and resources, and to prevent it from happening any further. There have to be legal reforms in place to ensure that our mineral, agricultural, land and other resources are not siphoned off to, for a limited number of elite, but instead flow to the rest of the people. And that primarily begins by civilian supremacy, not the kind you saw a couple of days back, but the fact that it has to be in place not just formally, but substantively, by ensuring that democracy is there in all decision making. And one can obviously critique that, well, I mean, there's still going to be patronage, still going to be inefficiency, still going to be informality, but it will still be better than what it is. And that needs to be understood, and the fact that we've never really had true democracy, because even in non-military periods of rule, there's always been this overhang of the military in terms of its corporations, in terms of its welfare trust, in terms of its recommendations and so on. So the fact that we can generate agricultural surpluses through land reform, and also the fact that we can use our mineral resources in an ecologically sustainable manner, and those surpluses have to be directed towards a labor-intensive industrial production, because without that we will not be able to create the sort of employment that this country needs based on its youth bulge, and the fact that our exports and imports will continue to suffer if that is not the case. There is definitely a need to re-evaluate WTO rules, trade rules, whereby tariffs, both tariffs and non-tariff barriers are reduced, and there's a definite need to re-look into them and put some of them in place to prevent dumping, especially of the kind that we've had to suffer because of China and the free trade agreement that we've signed with China, whereby what little production we had or manufacturing base we had in this country has suffered because now we just import cheap stuff from China. And also there's a need to invest in research, science and technology, so that Pakistan's economy can respond to the information age. That also starts with primarily the fact that there's a need to create a progressive, sustainable system of public finance, which means that tax avoidance and evasion have to be looked at both in real estate, large agribusiness and military businesses. There needs to be an audit of all exemptions, as Ammar has already mentioned, in terms of SROs and other reliefs that are provided to various large oligarchic interests in this country. There's a need to undertake a comprehensive audit of all past international debts and restructure and negotiate them accordingly. There's a need to rationalize defense expenditure so that unnecessary expenditure, which is non-combat related, which just relates to perks and privileges and capture of military and basically crowding out of the corporate sector, so that the corporate sector in this country is crowded out by military businesses, whereby the domestic bourgeoisie does not have really a lot of profitable avenues to expand in this country. And there needs to be a public sector reform, because there has to be this understanding that while public education, public health, housing and transport are wonderful things, but there is a deep mistrust in this country as far as their actual efficiency and quality is concerned. So that is only possible when those aspects are addressed. The distribution and use of land is extremely inefficient. Land in this country has become a capital trap, whereby capital goes in, nothing is produced, no employment is created, some people profit while others lose. So, and for that there has to be imposition of a land value tax, which is a tax on undeveloped property. So property that is just acquired for speculative gains, there has to be a tax on that, which will also undermine individual land accumulation. There has to be a change in zoning regulation to facilitate high rises, mixed use, and disincentivize sprawl, which is damaging ecologically and otherwise. There's also a need to disincentivize the phenomena of absentee landlordism and urban land holding, and actively incentivizing transfer of capital from unproductive large land holdings into financial savings. The agriculture sector has to be transformed, A, by land reform, so that it distributes land and extension services to small farmers, women farmers, and ensures free prices. The seed economy, the traditional seed economy in the indigenous seeds should be protected, and the monopoly of seed corporations should be abolished. There is a need to undertake public investment in processing, storage, transport, marketing for agricultural industries with high growth potential, and there is a need to reduce reliance on expensive fertilizers, pesticides, expensive inputs for our agriculture sector. And a lot of what I've laid out, that we've laid out in this paper, depends on spending on these four elements, or these four areas, which starts with labor and human capital. So education, health, education curricula, adult literacy, right to unionize, labor protection, minimum wage, which has to be increased to 30,000, since the prevailing minimum wage is not enough to survive given the rate of inflation in this country. Women's economic position can only be strengthened by affirmative action in employment, education, higher education, to ensure more of their participation in formal economy, targeted land reform, safer working environments, and anti-harassment legislation, public transport provision, credit provision, social provision of childcare, and this I think is unique in our context, paternity leave, and right to the reproductive health. Then there has to be banking for development, since as Ammar has already pointed out, our banking basically relies on the spread between what it pays to savers and what it makes from government securities, which is extremely inefficient, since a bank is not supposed to do that. A financial sector is supposed to channel savings to productive sectors in order to increase economic growth and production, which it's not doing. So that has to be done through a national investment bank to channel savings to manufacturing and reduction of spreads. And finally, there has to be sustainable and affordable energy in order for Pakistan to grow. The current energy privatization regime is exceptionally wasteful, inefficient, and costly, especially through fixed capacity payments that render it all too expensive for most of the people in this country. There has to be a reduction in reliance on thermal energy through investment in renewables and refinancing of IPP debt, which has exceeded 1.6 trillion as of a few days back. And there has to be a regulatory regime to reduce distortions between different energy sectors. So these are just some of the proposals that we've laid out. The rest are in the paper. These are just some of the ones that we think are the most important. So thank you all so much for listening to our presentation, for reading our paper, and hopefully now we can engage and understand more through some question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a comprehensive review and a reflective analysis. We are going to take a few questions. The floor is formally now opening up for the questions. We'll take questions in one round, 3 questions in one round. So please start. Please.
Can we goad certain individuals into asking questions? I would really like Parvez Tahir to ask a question. But no, please start. But this is just, I'm goading you, right? So that now.
Let's start with the
Sure, yeah. Yes. In a subsequent phase, please chime in.
My name is Saleemi and thank you so much for the presentation, all three speakers. I would like to explore a little bit about your proposition on land tax. Land and the value attached to it, I don't think that land tax proposition will help in the matter that you've discussed. Probably because the land and the value attached to it, there's a certain love for land in Pakistanis in general. So even if you have a land tax, the elasticity of that tax, you need to be cognizant of that. Is there a land tax elasticity estimation? And what about the tax burden shift? If you're talking about tycoons, even if you do tax them, they're just going to shift the burden to the consumers and the people who are going to buy land. And land in demand is probably not only because it's a very safe investment. But as I said, that historically, even from probably the colonial times, it's been attached with a value that the Pakistanis understand that this is something that we would like to invest in, and it has prestige attached to it, etc., so on and so forth. There's so many social things attached to land. So land tax elasticity and the tax burden shift, probably you would like to reconsider it, and maybe my proposition for like changing, I don't really agree with it. So maybe there should be financial sector reforms, that the financial sector and other areas should be made more attractive for people who want to save or people who want to earn money. What other alternative to a land as an asset would you propose, or would you like to brainstorm on? So maybe I would just like you to comment on it, or maybe think about it.
You're taking 3 questions at a time?
Assalamu alaikum, my name is Nadia Qureshi, I'm a researcher at PIDE. You know, yesterday we had a presentation here on donors and politics. I would like to, ask, put out the message that came out from the top. And so the basic message that came out from the top was that policy making from Pakistan has gone out to donors. And you know, all the prescriptions that you said were right, but if that is so, for whatever reason, how do you think all the prescriptions can be implemented practically within Pakistan? One. Secondly, I think you had a very strong assumption that if democracy comes, then all the problems, it will help in solving most of the problems that you were citing. However, if you look into the literature between how democracy impacts growth, it's very inconsistent. There are evidence of positive impact, there are evidence of negative impact, there is evidence of no impact whatsoever. And what is the most strong fact is that all the countries that are democratic have actually grown first, and then they became consolidated democracy. So, yeah.
Thank you, presenters, for the comprehensive presentation. I'm just worried about the role of politicians. There is no demand from the masses for change. Only thing we ask is about prices. Tomato prices are going up. That's the only hue and cry you see everywhere. No education, no health, nor do we ask, neither anybody provides. So there is no supply from the politicians. Roti, kapda, makan, insaf, and vote. So where does the politicians fit in? The only thing they could agree upon, all the parties, the major parties, was yesterday. When whatever you are saying is the problem, they think solutions lie there. So where does the change start?
Hello? Hello? Auntie, I think, hello? Can you hear me? Yes. I think you have a very good question about the land value tax. I do think we need to build an empirical basis in Pakistan's context for that. There is some work that is currently ongoing. Ali Seema at SERP, he's working on, with I think the urban unit, on building like an urban land cadastre in Lahore, and figuring out how actually land can be better valued and how much revenue can be accrued from that. The thing with the land value tax is the theoretical basis for this is that land is an asset in which the value of that asset is not determined by what you have done on it. I mean, maybe a building, yes, like what you constructed also helps determine the value. But land on its own is the bulk of the value of that land depends on like public investments around it. So for instance, if you have a road that leads up to it, then the land will have value. If you don't, if it's out in the boondocks, it'll have very little value. So it's essentially, most of the value of urban land specifically comes from public investments and the public's revenue essentially. So there's a theoretical basis for making the claim that so a large part of the value of that land should then accrue back to the public as well, instead of completely being privatized as is currently being done. The land value tax, obviously, as a standalone measure, may not make a lot of sense if concurrent measures are not being taken to make other avenues of investment and savings more attractive for ordinary middle class people. So it definitely needs to happen in concurrence with other measures. And when you ask about, what other measures are there, I think that's where the state's industrial policy comes in, and its support to small and medium enterprises, and the creation of an institutional environment in which people can make safe, secure investments in other kinds of enterprises, and credit is also extended for those same things. But right now, I think and I agree with you completely that it's a cultural issue as well. Like, it's about the social value of land in this society, and I think it's about the remnants, in some senses, of a feudal sort of association with land. And I think so part of that is a struggle against that sort of cultural conception, because of which we continue to sort of reproduce feudal inequalities in our cities. So, for instance, there's data about how 70% of Karachi lives on 22% of the land in the city. So these are cultural conceptions that are very destructive. So why is it that in a poor country like Pakistan, the common conception of an urban plot is a 1 canal 500 gas plot? That everyone wants to get that 1 canal plot and they want to save up for that. And in a country that is exponentially richer than us, say the United Kingdom, you have plot sizes, normal average plot sizes for middle class homes, which are 1/5 of that size. I mean, we've gotten used to sort of like treating land as this sort of like the thing that has a lot of prestige and value associated with it. So part of this struggle for us is also changing the social value of that land. And I think, again, of course, on its own, a land value tax will not work. I think we need plenty of other measures. We need to first, it was in our list of proposals as well, we need to adequately document urban land. Currently, we do not really have anything resembling an urban land cadastre, which would be the basis of determining land values and the taxes that would then be levied on it. So if we can push for the documentation of urban land, as it's sort of now been done at the rural level, if we can do that at the urban level, then I think we'll be in a much better position. We'll reduce so many of the information asymmetries that cause such a massive inequality in land distribution and ownership. And then we'll be able to better sort of use instruments like land value tax. Currently, the informal nature of the sector doesn't really allow for so much of this to happen. So again, it has to do with a lot of concurrent measures, and again, assessing obviously the elasticity, as you said, but that can only be really done if you have a documentation of the land that exists. Do you want to add anything to this question? Or no, okay. And in terms of there was a question about the role of politicians and with no public demand for change, I partly agree with you that this is a massive problem in Pakistan, but I think again we have to look into the historical origins of this problem. If you look back into the 70s, 60s and 70s, there was a lot of public demand for change. There were a lot of public mobilization for change. A lot of those changes actually even came into effect for a certain period, and maybe the early years of the first People's Party government in the 70s. I think what we see subsequently happening in the 70s and 80s onwards is the destruction of the institutions which allow for public demand to be mobilized, public demand for reform to be mobilized, such as student unions, for instance, or trade unions. These are vehicles for ordinary people's participation in political politics, and this was accompanied by a state-led process of institutionalizing clientelism within our political system. So such as, for instance, during the Zia regime, banning political parties altogether and making politics only about your local constituency level, sort of small level infrastructure issues, nala, duty, sadak, and reducing politics to that, while the military and bureaucrats take care of the larger questions of economic policy or foreign policy or all of that sort of thing. So I think this has, and then there's also the question of how local governments have been used in the same way, and even during the Musharraf regime, for instance. Powers were taken away from the parties and given to local government systems, and they were made autonomous in a way trying to bypass political authority and create a direct connection from the executive to the local level. And that again sort of like localized politics, municipalized politics, so to speak. So I think so there's a lot of concurrent measures that need to take place for that, which again have to do with like politics essentially. So for instance, restoring student unions so that ordinary people, middle class people who are not simply feudals or land barons or industrialists can also get into politics, and which that we've dried up that entire avenue of ordinary people, and similarly for trade unions. And then it's also about trying to institute effective local governments so that municipal issues can actually be dealt with at the municipal level, and larger, broader calls for economic, social, political reform can actually take place at the parliamentary level where they should be, and then at level assemblies. So again, I think these are questions of political change. When you say what is the role of politicians, I think it's about like changing the kinds of politicians we're producing. It's about making sure that people from institutions like here, instead of just getting a job in an international financial institution or moving to the US, can actually also, there are avenues for them to also step into politics, which currently don't exist. Even for people like us, it's very, very hard. People like us who've done this for the last few decades, but getting into mainstream politics is very difficult because of the reasons that I just mentioned. So I think these things have to be taken down. That's why we keep talking about bringing politics back into the discussion, because these things are so deeply interlinked.
Yeah, very briefly. So this question of donors or larger sort of literature on democracy versus development. I mean, I think that quite aside from the global literature, which, as you say, is inconclusive, if we just look at Pakistan's history, yeah, I mean, of course, this is a country that's been run by military regimes for half of its existence, and as I said when I started, it's, you almost inevitably find donors chiming in with unelected regimes, and then, particularly with Musharraf, this whole like, this is great this is good governance, and this is great, and then suddenly in 2006 saying, oh no, it's not so great anymore. I mean, this is a story, in some ways this is about, this paper wasn't about the IMF, this paper wasn't about the whole global financial architecture, but as I said when I spoke, it's now subject to a serious crisis of legitimacy, at least in the West. We've got a different problem. We are, with all due respect, we're still harping on about policies that 10 years ago the rest of the world was like, oh, this has stopped working now. Now, it's another matter that there's no institutional, the institutions of political and economic decision-making have lagged. Change in those institutional logics has lagged behind this larger awareness of the fact that something fundamentally is wrong here. And this is a structural sort of unfolding that's taken place over 40 years, right? Ammar mentioned briefly that the whole structure of the global economy has changed. Everywhere you look, I spent the last couple of 3 or 4 months in England, and it was remarkable to me. You go to East London, which were like huge industrial working class areas, and they've been totally gentrified. And all it is one big, huge gated housing community, and yuppies renting flats. And that's, so in some ways, this is a global phenomenon. The value of global real estate is something outrageous now. Like, what is it, 700 trillion, something like the difference between real goods and services, and then sort of, so this is a problem with intellectuals and donors. This is a problem with people at large, because we can't imagine anything beyond this, right? So if there's no bijli, if we have the means, we'll go and buy a generator or a UPS, right? And this was not the time. It's difficult for us, for me, I mean for all of us, to write a paper like this, because on the one hand, there is no short-term fix here, right? These are longer-term structural issues, whether they're domestically or globally. I would say, I agree with you. I don't think democracy, we're not suggesting democracy. I mean, I think what Nawfal said was some kind of substantive process of democratization of decision-making. And that's the point. All around the world, we also have evidence, like China is the most obvious example. Yes, the size of the pie can increase really, really quickly under authoritarian regimes, but who gets what share of the pie will also become more and more inegalitarian. And this is something that, mind you, even the China and the India growth story, right, the mythical growth stories of the last 15 to 20 years are now in a state of disrepair, at least in the Indian economy is in a bad way. So that there's something specific about Pakistan in this story, which of course we've tried to highlight. There's something global about this story as well. And I think that is something that we'll wait to play out. Nobody's suggesting that just having a civilian or elected government in play will change all of these dynamics straight away. But you know, there's local level contradictions that we have to deal with, and then you juxtapose them, those specific ones, upon a larger question. And that's why I think it was crucial, and then Nawfal made this point. We have a short-term horizon when what we're thinking about what you can actually do. If you have that too requires will, because if you don't have the will, it won't happen, right? If basically, you know, you're importing people who are, you know, heads of the IFIs into major decision-making posts, and that's why I wanted PT to sort of share some insights with us, because we've been having these conversations for 20 years, and the reality is that, you know, any kind of autonomous decision-making about what you're doing is increasingly a pipe dream, right? And that's even worse now than it was 20 years ago, right? Back in the day, it was you know, it's not even used anymore, it's phenomenal, but 15 years ago there was all of this, you know, structural adjustment was also suffering from a crisis of legitimacy, and so they called it poverty reduction strategy paper, if you remember. That's gone now, it's not even in the lingo is. So the donor lingo can change, the story doesn't change very much, and all we're trying to do is say, look, let's at least introduce these questions into the discussion. You know, we're not under no delusion that any of these proposals are in and of themselves a panacea. The larger question of transforming state and society is a long-term project. It requires will. As you know, we all wear different hats as well, so we try and do that. And Ammar has pointed out that even that is, you're always beset by a series of structural impediments that prevent, you know, whether it's intellectually or politically, from deepening these debates. So I hear you, I follow you, and you know, I understand what you're referring to, but I would say in Pakistan's context, to talk about democratizing this whole apparatus and then decision making, I think is a unique is something that is uniquely specific as well. Quite aside from the fact that if we were like every other country in the world and we had democratic governments or, you know, parliaments doing this exclusively, I don't think we would be that much further ahead than where we are. We would be like all other similar countries that have also for 30 years dealt with these programs and now are dealing with a global economy that is cyclically, you know, it's another matter altogether. It's been 10 years since the financial crisis. Who knows when the next one comes? It could be right around the corner, because in some ways all of those bubbles are back in a big way, and not a lot has changed. Instead, as I said, you have now a rhetoric saying, "Oh, let's just change everything. Let's just shut all of this down," even while the you know, global financial logics remain largely untrammeled. So I follow your what you're pointing to. And all that, you know, we're just trying to sort of suggest ways in which these debates, you know, deserve some space here in such settings, so that this is a long process either way.
So just to briefly add on from what Aasim said, on the question of democracy and authoritarian regimes, I think there's just, I think one of the specificities of Pakistan and similarly placed countries in terms of democratic institutions is multi-ethnicity and the diversity of certain contexts. And as opposed to, it's very different to say, okay, authoritarian regimes can work really well in places like Hong Kong or Singapore, perhaps, but in places like Pakistan and India, it's much more difficult. And I think someone who's done really good work on this is Mushtaq Khan, who teaches at SOAS, and his work on political settlements and he's looked at like the industrialization strategy Pakistan followed for the first few decades of its existence, which initially met with a lot of success in terms of generating productive surpluses in the 50s onwards, and even in Ayub's era. But then he talks about how the state really didn't take into account the political settlement, which is essentially the distribution of political power within the polity, and included and specific excluded groups where there were many groups that were excluded from that process, which resulted in political opposition to those very industrialization strategies. So, for instance, so much of 1971 and the agitation that led to the founding of Bangladesh had to do with jute producers in Bangladesh and how they felt that their agricultural surpluses were just being used to being funneled into for industrialization in West Pakistan, and they were not incorporated, and the benefits of that industrialization did not really accrue to them. And he compares it with India, where the state followed a similar industrialization policy, state-led industrialized growth, but the main difference was the Congress Party in India, which had much broader grassroots network, and it had representation from multiple kinds of political actors across the spectrum, and they were able to sort of like get a buy-in from all those actors so they were able to sustain the same policies for much longer than Pakistan was, because our rulers didn't really take into account the democratic impulsions of the political settlement and shape the policies accordingly. So I think so that sort of sheds some light into why that's sort of necessary, the kind of democratic institution we might need in our context.
Do we have more questions from the floor?
Hello, I'm Rashid from Sajjad University. I would like to ask, the army's business model has been this rentier state, been leveraging its use strategic position. Is this business model in a crisis, in the sense that they can't necessarily, since the war in Palestine might be toning down, that America is moving towards different sort of settlement in South Asia? And secondly, because a lot of, like, right now Pakistan is in the IMF program in part because of it spent too much of its foreign exchange on CPEC. I was wondering how CPEC and all of these fit into your state industrialization program, and if the army is facing, in a sense, a crisis of its business model, and is it moving towards some sort of different sort of form of paying off its people and spending.
We have one more question.
Thank you, Paul has asked me to introduce myself. My name is Aasim and I'm a lecturer at NIPS. And part of my question is kind of related to my own sort of research that I've done on water issues and irrigation and infrastructure development. First of all, thank you so much for this very comprehensive analysis. It's really refreshing to see all sorts of different angles and statistics weaved into this very interesting story. My only sort of, it's not even a question, more of a provocation around the recommendation to shift from rentier to development. Because as much as Pakistan has leveraged its geostrategic position, we know that there is even a longer history of developmentalism, particularly in the irrigation sector, and that's kind of very much tied into the debt as well. Like not only the initial construction of these large infrastructure projects, but also just the centrality of the World Bank in terms of India-Pakistan water sharing, and then the constant upkeep of the problem. And as we get more and more aware of the environmental disaster that is Pakistan's irrigation sector, with huge destruction, particularly in the downstream areas, and loss of productive land and whatnot. So there's kind of like, there's a sort of a history of this interweaving of that rentier model with this kind of like long-term historical development. So I was wondering, I don't assume that the suggestion to go to developmentalism is the same developmentalism, but I was wondering if there's something that you recommend, or maybe have some open questions around these kind of things. What is it that we need to know to do developmentalism in a slightly different kind of way? And I'll add on a slight question. If it's like, what kind of questions are coming up for you? Is like, what do we need to learn more? Like, I think Ammar responded to a question about the land and the value, the cultural sort of stickiness of certain choices that people are making. But I was just curious if you have other interesting questions that are coming up, for the audience as well in general. Like, what is it that we need to do to research more on these lines?
Yeah, my question is related to the debt utilization and the debt burden. So far as the debt utilization is concerned, most of the debt are used by the influential people, whereas the debt burden can be shifted to the common man, and the common man can pay through taxes and as well as through heavy utility bills.
Sure. Look, CPEC is a sacred cow. And it sort of relates to what Aasim also pointed about sort of the whole model of development. I mean, like I said, this is a paper written with one hat on. If there was another hat, the hat that I prefer to wear, then maybe we wouldn't have written this paper in a way. Because, I mean, like I said at the outset, the purpose was to sort of engage with the mainstream and say, look, we're not calling for anything super outrageous. But there is a need to call for outrageous things as well. And these are different time horizons. And so, of course, even if you look at, for instance, what happened in Latin America with the pink tide, they ran into the contradictions of the fact that they were still reliant on high commodity prices. And the moment the commodity, oil and gas plummeted, Venezuela and Bolivia were in trouble. So you cannot, whether the question is, we are simply saying, okay, within the context of a global capitalist economy, what can you do to at least better your situation? Crucially for us, better means not just increasing the size of the pie, but distributing whatever gains you have more equally, which is a fundamental issue, and demilitarizing the economy. These are not radical. But when you talk about CPEC or the question of development at large, I mean, most people will say, oh well, you don't really have a choice with CPEC. They were going to do this no matter what. Perhaps. Then you don't really have a choice with anything, right? Then you don't have a choice changing the orientation of your state away from sort of a national security type apparatus to something that at least does allocate a bigger chunk of its resources to people. But how do you do so? How do you redress the fact that you've now destroyed local ecologies in a way that perhaps it's very hard to see how you will regenerate unless you change something quite fundamental. These are obviously much longer time horizon and significantly different political questions. The evidence is clear to whatever extent it's out there with regards to CPEC and the early harvest projects. If there's going to be a huge debt burden. Will it trigger, what Ammar was talking about, like manufacturing or generate jobs? As of now, there's no evidence. The second phase is about to start, which is the export processing zones. What kind of horror stories will be associated with those in terms of whatever labor is hired is another matter. Will it actually generate employment? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. I mean, there's so many overlapping factors, right? Because then if you do sort of trigger some manufacturing industry, then you have other questions. Do you have enough gas and electricity to give them 24-hour sort of production? These are also parallel questions, right? Are you paying so much for your electricity or importing so much oil that you can't actually generate the space to actually support I mean, there are so many overlapping questions, and then the fear is, and the evidence with regards to retail manufacturing is that there's no competitiveness. So ultimately you will have firms, Pakistani firms will either go out of business or will just become comprador to Chinese firms. And what are the long-term consequences of that? Will it generate the kinds of big job surpluses that were being talked about? I don't see it. And what are and that's quite aside from CPEC on agriculture, for instance. That's a different matter entirely. Or Chinese soft power more generally, in the fact that everybody wants to learn Mandarin these days. You know, I mean, these are separate matters, and what are the long-term consequences of that? The last the only other thing you mentioned about the business model. I'm going to try to stay within the realm of some decent economic language. I mean, frankly, if the business model changes fundamentally, they go out of business. You know, the whole business model is based on the idea that they are indispensable. And the whole question of indispensability comes about by keeping us in a perpetual state of, in some ways, insecurity. So that there is an institution that then helps secure us no matter what. That is the business model. Whether it happens with regards to fears from your neighbors or fears from some nebulous other that's far away, or ever, that can't change. If that changes, there is no business model. You understand? Then it's like you retreat. Then you do a Turkey, or an Indonesia, or a Nigeria. And that was done too, by the way. The Turkish army, or the Indonesian army, or the Nigerian army sort of retreated by virtue of them being guaranteed some of their corporate interests were protected. So ultimately, if I think within the logic of the mainstream, that's what would happen in the medium to long run. But the business model of like strategic rents and like indispensability, if that shifts, that's when that sort of retreat to something where there's less primacy for the military, and sort of they're of course there, but they're not there in a big way. Otherwise, I don't see that business model changing fundamentally. In fact, I see it intensifying, right? Because now it's a question of you have to have political influence and power to protect the myriad economic interests that you've generated. Like, they're so enormous that, we're not talking about like a standing institution. We're talking about like generations of people associated. It's like a wider multiplier effect, right? So many people associated with that whole entity. And so that then creates an impetus within. Say, okay, well, we need continue to maintain political power and influence to protect our material interests. So I can't see that changing in any fundamental way, unless there's some kind of popular uprising or demand for it, and that too will take time to build, and courage, of course, crucially. Finally, have a PD question.
Because I think we're running out of time.
Yeah, please.
Well, the paper could have been written 10 years ago.
Yeah.
The more you change it, the more it's the same thing. There's actually a local verse which says, "Halat hazar ko kai baras guzar gaye." And that is what it is. I think we missed the bus because in the early stages of development, we need to get rid of feudalism and a colonial bureaucracy or whatever exists in the Middle East. You actually have to destroy it. Maoist China did it for the present China. The present China is unimaginable without Maoist. The Japanese did it for East Asia. Their enemies were the feudal elite, so They destroyed them, and it was followed by land reform. We missed that. India, in its multicultural polity, tried, but has not been able to sustain. See, all that has come back. So what do we do? I don't know. I had thought that somehow, democracy keeps on moving, still better than the alternative that we have been practicing. But even democracy, and the surprising thing is, what we have today has been done by changed leaders.
Yeah.
And some of, one group that was so far source of remittances is now actually ruling. And you cannot say that you are ruled by ignorant people. And this is what they have brought us to. The same IMF, and so much so that the vested interests go to the biggest vested interest to safeguard their interests. The businessmen, the bureaucracy, these are the two who create rent and share rent. And look where they have to go for protecting their interests. Just look at your budget. The largest item, the IMF has changed the agenda by talking about primary deficit and so on. The largest item and the second largest item are actually related. The second largest item does not let you do things for the third largest item, and therefore the first largest item keeps on expanding, keeps on increasing, and this is a perpetual. And how do you try to manage it? We talked about it yesterday. You bring in donors and all kinds of development programs are announced. I mean, for the third time, you will have something reform in FDR. They had funding from the World Bank, and the project was called Tax Reform, Tax Administration Reform from the Start. Turned out to be a trap. You have now another. You bring in money in the game of SDGs, in the name of poverty, but you can be sure that the only purpose is to have some budget support and support the balance of payments. The declared objectives are not used. And of property, well, you have the world ruled by a property crisis.
Yep.
So bubbles are for the asking. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am Rashid, working in the field of biology studies and implementation. I don't know how many questions, but I have two questions on this field. I am more interested to get your insight on the topics of debt trading, Pakistan, and US-China tax war in South Asia. This is my first question, and the second question is, why some countries are under debt trade and some are not, and how the economic indicators in the country shape up the political structure inside Pakistan. Thank you.
Well, as far as debt trapping and proxy wars are concerned,
I think in many ways what Chinese investment in Pakistan has to be understood as is a crisis of capital accumulation. So what happens is global financial system collapses. China struggles to expand the way it was and the way it needs to, given the fact that it's so authoritarian and its legitimacy depends on a rapidly expanding middle class and consumerism. So what it looked for, and this is a long-term project as far as they are concerned, is for profitable avenues outside China. And that's been the case in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Pakistan as well. And as far as CPEC investments are concerned, so far they don't really seem to be economically profitable, right? As far as Pakistan has borrowed, a lot of that is power, so power production, which promises a very good rate of return, but is also very expensive. And in long-term manner, it's not really sustainable for this country, ecologically and financially. So I think in many ways that has to be understood. And what was asked earlier, in terms of the strategic location, given the fact that it is a strategic location and that in itself is a strategic curse, that's the resource and that's the curse which leads to underdevelopment. Pakistan is doing pretty much the same thing with China, which it was initially doing with the US. So I think in many ways this has to be understood as not a fundamental shift, but as more of the same. And as far as why are some countries under debt trap and others not, I think if you look at, it obviously has colonial roots, right? So what was the situation at the time of independence? What sort of independence was it? How many of the structures of that colonial regime were withered away? In Pakistan, it was the other way around. So the military bureaucratic oligarchy actually strengthened as a result of partition, and those pacts with the US and the West during the Cold War just strengthened that even further. So as an anecdote, if one goes to Ayub Park, where they have a military museum where there are lots of military equipment, artillery, tanks and so on, most of what you find there is US, right? So they're not even interested in manufacturing weapons, they just borrow them. And what's been said earlier, as far as debt is concerned, those purchases of weapons on a scale so large that this country cannot afford leads to further underdevelopment because you need to pay off those loans. So those loans have to be paid off by more loans. And as far as primary deficits are concerned, most people just do not care about them, they don't know about them. What they care about is their income, their expenditure, and their employment. So just the fact that it becomes so technocratic and so jargon loaded that it just becomes totally removed, and that's why the fact that our advisor to the Prime Minister of Finance said that tomatoes were for 17 rupees and the fact that they weren't, but for 300 rupees, that just signifies the gap that exists between those who make their decisions on behalf of the people and the people. And as far as it's the question of debt trap, if you want to add further on that, it could be the countries that were able to manufacture and establish a manufacturing base earlier on were able to actually not become indebted, or not at least fell into the debt trap and were not constrained by it. So Southeast Asian tigers, a lot of that was government spending, government regulation, government barriers in order to facilitate that growth. And how does this economic impact lead to politics, right? That's a question. I mean, it's very, in a way, it's straightforward as well, because given how financial flows come in. So, for instance, when the IMF program was going to be signed, the US said that this balance of payment support should not be used to pay off CPEC loans, right? So obviously those international financial institutions, they remain dominated by US hegemonic interests. How hegemonic they are, that's another question, probably not as much as they were previously, and China has plenty of room to maneuver. But in terms of what it leads to, will lead to changes at the top, at the international level, but not necessarily changes for people or population at large, in terms of what, it's going to be more of the same. So more indebtedness, more strategic negotiations and selling of land and resources to international powers. And that only changes if there is a mass interest in change, not the sort of tabdili sarkar wali change, but actual change which is meaningful. And this was the purpose of this paper, to start a conversation towards that, to have some meaningful debate beyond just austerity and structural adjustment.
Just briefly, add on to what you were saying about debt traps. I think it's just important to remember that debt traps and international debt is a structural feature of the global economic order, and it's something that Marx spoke about 150 years ago. Piketty spoke about it more recently. It keeps reducing itself because the capitalist system inherently, after every few years, decades, tends towards a crisis of overproduction, and it tends to repress demand, larger public demand, because wages eventually tend to get stagnated under the capitalist system periodically, which has been happening in the globally for the past 30 odd years. So when demand gets suppressed, but you still need to be able to sell your goods, then that's where debt comes in, and that's how the international financial order works. So countries have essentially been loaded with debt and then flooded with goods that have been produced in capitalist countries, the surplus goods that the regular wage demand cannot go up cannot actually meet up with. So debt is utilized for that purpose. And the countries that have been like more embedded in these international financial orders because of their political alliances with the United States are more indebted. Countries that followed a relatively more non-aligned strategy and focused, like Modi said, on building their domestic productive base rather than just consumption-fueled imports are less indebted. So, I mean, I think that's just the structural feature of the system to bear in mind. And just briefly, because Aasim's question wasn't answered about developmentalism, and obviously we absolutely are not advocating for return to 20th century developmentalism. I think the answers are not completely clear, but I think the beginnings of some kind of new approach can be maybe seen in the Green New Deal ideas being spoken of. There's no question developmentalism anymore without talking about the ecology and how we can actually regenerate what has been lost. So I think it's about trying to figure out, can there be something like a regenerative growth strategy in which you can actually generate economic value from restoring the ecological destruction, reversing it in some way? I think that's what we need to think a lot about.
Or just canned growth entirely, just degrowth. There's also lots of talk about that happening these days.
Yeah. Thank you so much. On that note, we'll take an end, and a huge round of applause for all our speakers for a wonderful conversation, for a wonderful presentation and an equally engaging conversation. Tea is served upstairs for further discussion. Please join us. Thank you.
Thank you.